Thank you, Abby, for that. And thank you, Abby, for that. And thank you, Kat, for the introduction. Uh, my name is Grace Carson. I'm Yavapai and Chiricahua Apache. My family is from Oklahoma and also New Mexico. And I am so honored to be here today to talk to you all about my favorite subject, which is restorative justice and peacemaking. This webinar that I'm going to be doing is mostly an overview, so it might go over topics not as deeply as you would like, but my contact information will be at the end, and you can always contact me. But there also will be a lovely series of other webinars after this, and we'll talk about that and announce that later. But just in case you're getting into this and you're like, oh, I wish I had more, there will be more provided by TLPI. So that's very exciting. I am a Skadden Fellow here at Tribal Law and Policy Institute. You don't really need to know what that means, but basically that just means that I am a graduate of a law school, and so I'm legally trained, and that I get paid to do this work and get to talk to you all. And my work specifically does focus on restorative justice and peacemaking, as well as healing to wellness courts. So you might hear me mention healing to wellness courts throughout this as well, just because right now that's where a lot of my focus is, and that's where a lot of my inspiration for my restorative justice work comes from. Additionally, I do a lot of writing and a lot of research and scholarship around restorative justice and peacemaking and tribal justice in general. So I might tie that in as well. So that's a little bit about me, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a little overview of what this presentation will entail. We'll go over an overview of what restorative justice is. I feel like that's thrown around a lot, both in Indigenous spaces and non-Indigenous criminal legal reform spaces. And so I just want to get us on the same page of like what I mean when I talk about restorative justice and what a lot of Indigenous communities mean when we talk about restorative justice, because I feel like non-Native communities don't often acknowledge that restorative justice came from Indigenous peoples. And it's important that we stick to those roots and those ties when we talk about restorative justice, because that's what it is, which is super cool. And I'll get more into that. And then I'll also talk about what peacemaking is, give an overview of what that looks like now and what that's looked like in the past for tribes, and kind of what we are talking about when we talk about peacemaking. I'll give an overview of why peacemaking is important and useful for tribes, which, spoiler alert, I think it's super important and super useful for tribes. And I'll expand on how peacemaking relates to restorative justice, and how it addresses issues within tribal communities and can be used in all communities at its roots. And then lastly, I'll talk about what restorative justice and peacemaking can look like for tribes today. Another spoiler alert, it can look like a variety of things, because tribes are all different and tribes are also evolving. Different tribes have different issues. And so really, and this is the beauty of restorative justice and peacemaking, it can look like anything. There's some few core principles, and I will get into this, but I think that's the really cool part about that. This is a really innovative area of not just law, but innovative area of addressing harm and preventing harm and healing harm. So yeah, that's what this presentation will look like. We can get to the next slide. So the first part we'll go over is, what is restorative justice? And then next slide, sorry. So restorative justice is an approach to justice that attempts to restore harms at its roots. This means that it understands that harm is not done as an isolated event. Nobody wakes up, well, very few people wake up and are like, I'm ready to cause harm to somebody today. And without any, it doesn't just happen on its own. It's done in the context of systemic oppression, such as white supremacy, settler colonialism, patriarchy, poverty. Restorative justice also recognizes that harm cannot be detached from trauma, both direct trauma that a person has experienced, but also historical and generational traumas that a community and people have experienced within that community. And it also acknowledges that these traumas that people experience are often a direct result of the systemic oppressions in which we live in. So patriarchy often leads to specific traumas that create the cycle of abuse and harm. And ultimately, restorative justice recognizes that even the perpetrator of harm, even the person who harmed somebody, is also harmed in the injury that they cause. So it's not, victim and person who perpetrated the harm. It's this understanding that it's all a circle, that even the person who is causing harm is harmed within their injury to another person. Restorative justice can take many forms, but ultimately it prioritizes community safety. I think that this is some pushback I can sometimes get when I talk about restorative justice. It's like, yeah, like, the person who caused harm, like, but they cause harm and like we need to protect our communities. But what we really talk about when we talk about restorative justice is it's a way to fully protect our communities. And that's always the center of what restorative justice is. So while restorative justice does recognize the humanity and the person who caused harm, it always prioritizes the safety and well-being of the person who was harmed first, and then also the community as a whole. And this is different than an adversarial system that we see within Western justice systems. When we see an adversarial system, such as Western courts, we see that it usually puts legality and these ideals of what Western justice is above all. So it's a little bit different from restorative justice, which is trying to get to the root of the issue, and is trying to get to the healing rather than this idea of justice in these like legal terms. In restorative justice, the survivor of harm gets a say in what happens to them as well, as in a way that they don't necessarily get in Western courts. So they get to have a say in what the process looks like. They get to have a say whether or not they enter this restorative justice process. And that's different than what often happens in Western courts. Restorative justice views harm as a community issue. So again, it's not just a harm like that. It's not just the person that was harmed that is harmed. The harm done to one person is a harm done to the entire community. So it's seeking not just to heal one person or a few people. It's seeking to heal the community as a whole. And this is also counter to what we see in a lot of Western adversarial forms of justice. Importantly, accountability from the perpetrator of harm is necessary. I feel like this is often a pushback I get from people who don't quite understand what restorative justice is. Like, what about the accountability? What about the person, or what about, the person being accountable for their actions? And so, while restorative justice sees humanity in the perpetrator of harm and it does seek to restore them, it also recognizes that a part of this healing process necessitates accountability of the harm that they've caused. So this is essential to the process of restorative justice. Um, and it's important to note here that accountability is not the same as punishment. I think that that's where people can sometimes get confused. They think when there's a lack of punishment that there's a lack of accountability. And that's because it's understandable. Like today, we often use those terms interchangeably, but there are some key differences between those two terms, and I like to take time to point out what those differences are. So accountability is meant to stop the harm from happening, while punishment is just a way of enforcing rules. So that's kind of the key differences between the two. But some traits of accountability specifically is the process of accountability is founded on the premise that when harm is done, the harm creates an obligation to the person harmed and then also to the community in which the harm took place. Because again, through restorative justice, we're seeing that harm hurts all people, everyone in the community. Accountability is often active and it can be proactive. So the one who committed the harm can initiate the accountability process rather than waiting for a consequence to be imposed upon them. The most effective accountability processes are voluntary and they're ongoing. So it's more of a process than a single event, right? When somebody's going to jail, it's like, okay, you're in jail, now you're out, that's it. Whereas accountability asks you to be like an active participant in the process, which is a lot harder actually than punishment. The person or the persons who were harmed are active participants, again, in the accountability process, along with the person who committed the harm. And so this is counter to what some traits we see in punishment. Sometimes the process of punishment can be violent or shaming, and this way punishment can sometimes be seen as a continuation of that harm rather than a resolution to harm. Because if you're further harming the perpetrator of harm, they're not healing. They're going to get out of jail or whatever punishment they received and continue that cycle of harm. It's usually coerced, so most people don't volunteer to be punished. The type of punishment may or may not be decided in consultation with the victim. Whether it's a timeout or suspension, being expelled, incarcerated, punishment is often isolating. So it involves being taken out of somebody's community, whereas restorative justice, because again, it sees harm done to an entire community, it's often done with the community. Being punished only requires that a person endure the suffering imposed upon them. It's a very passive event. To complete punishment, one must only not escape. It requires neither agency nor dignity, nor does it require any real work, which again is why punishment is simply easier usually. And then the issue of repair and restoration is rarely, if ever, addressed in punishment. The focus on retribution rather than repair, the focus is on retribution rather than repair and healing. An important part of this is that accountability has to be a voluntary process, which is what makes restorative justice really messy and hard work. So accountability has to be voluntary on the part of the person who committed harm, but also, the entire restorative justice process, the victim of harm also has to volunteer to be in that process as well. And then, of course, restorative justice is directly derived from Indigenous peoples and tribes' traditional ways of practicing. This is super important to me as an Indigenous person, as somebody who's in both, tribal communities and spaces, but also non-tribal spaces, and hearing them sometimes talk about restorative justice in this really like detached way from Indigenous values and beliefs and ways of being can sometimes be frustrating for me. Because I think restorative justice is most effective when it's actually coming from these roots and from this culture and these practices. And that's why it's incredible that, tribes really are leading the way in restorative justice, and restorative justice most effectively takes place in tribal communities because we're the people who created it. And so I think that that's really cool. We've practiced restorative justice since time immemorial through peacemaking, which I'll get into, and also other practices. And it's often co-opted by Western legal systems. But in many ways, the theories that inform restorative justice came from Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. And it's not a new concept, and it shouldn't be divested from its roots. You can go to the next slide. So see here that restorative justice, that in restorative justice, there's the victim, there's the offender, and then there's, the community. And we see that they all have a role in healing the harm that took place. So each party has a role in restoring the harmony. So they have the role of the community and the victim have a role of establishing community safety. And, the community has a larger role in that because they're the person, they're taking up that role. They also have a role in asking of accountability of the harm caused. And then there's also the role of developing competency with the offender. And that just means working on developing healthy behaviors and emotional regulation and other forms of healing for the offender. And that usually takes place between the community and the offender. So this is just showing the point that, through restorative justice, everybody has a role in this. It's not just the responsibility of a few people, it's the responsibility of everyone. And we can go to the next slide. So again, restorative justice is able to be flexible depending on the community, but these are just some basic principles of restorative justice. So crime or harm, another word, replacement for that, is a violation of people, including the perpetrator of harm, and it's also a violation of relationships. Victims in the community are central to the justice process. A primary focus of a justice process is to assist victims and address their needs. The secondary focus is restoring on the community to the degree that that's possible. And it's also the belief that all human beings have dignity and worth. Get to the next slide. And so there are many restorative justice processes. You can see a few here, and I will talk about a few specifically. Again, I mostly focus on peacemaking, but I'll mention a few other ones throughout this presentation. There's just many different moving parts of each of these processes. So we see different parts for different, again, parties of restorative justice. And we see important values and important, things that need to be done in order for restorative justice to be achieved. We see safety, we see free and informed consent. We see focusing on the needs of victims, collaborative agreement, responsibility and obligation, supports, therapeutic services, reintegration. Um, and these are the moving parts that we see of all restorative justice processes, whether it be peacemaking, healing to wellness court, or whatever else it is. We can get to the next one. All right, so let's talk a little bit about peacemaking. I know I've thrown that word around quite a bit, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So peacemaking is one traditional way of practicing restorative justice that has come from tribes, although, again, as mentioned before, peacemaking is still evolving as tribes themselves evolve, as their needs evolve, as their issues evolved. It's not a stagnant thing or a thing in the past, it is still living. Peacemaking can most simply be described as a process where people can talk together to resolve conflict. So, again, it's not one size fits all. It's a cultural practice that varies in each tribe. So, historically, every tribe had a different version of what we now call peacemaking. Not every tribe, many tribes, I should say. Um, but it's important to note here that peacemaking can be pulled from tribes' traditional ways that they used in the past, but also not all tribes have access to their traditional peacemaking processes and traditions because of colonization. And so, essential belief of peacemaking is that tribes are able to borrow and work with other tribes in their current peacemaking systems, and we see that a lot today. And is kind of the principle of why we do TA with tribes on peacemaking, and are allowed to borrow from each other, which I think is really cool. And again, just peacemaking evolves as tribes' needs evolve. Um, Peacemaking is a community-based process that addresses the concerns of all parties, much like restorative justice in general. Peacemaking is more than just about resolving conflict. I think people often, when we hear about peacemaking, they think of circle keeping, which I will get into. And that's a huge part, even the biggest part, I guess, of peacemaking. But it's also about preventing conflict because you can't just like continuously, and this is kind of like what more Western system does, where it addresses a harm that takes place. In order to get to its roots, really, you have to start to work towards prevention as well. And so that's usually implemented in peacemaking programs and peacemaking courts. Um, so this is huge because it has to also involve active work to prevent harm, not just within the individual, but also active work to prevent harm as a community and systemically. So again, talking about these big systemic issues like patriarchy, a big part of like really implementing peacemaking is also working in your community to make sure that that things like that are being addressed, and men are healing, and we're doing that work as well. So for an example, and this is what I often talked about when I talk to tribes who are implementing and enhancing their healing wellness courts. A community might be experiencing more instances of drug use from youth than normal, but rather than seeing it as an individual issue with each youth, peacemaking might involve looking deeper at why drug use among youth has increased. So it might ask questions like, are there enough accessible therapy clinics for youth in the community to address their personal and generational trauma? Is there enough summer programming to keep youth entertained and active in a healthy way? Is there enough accessible cultural programming and events in the community to keep youth connected to our healthy ways of living? And other more issues that get to the root and start to prevent this harm, in this case, like drug use, maladaptive drug use, more systemically rather than taking it as an individual case. And importantly, peacemaking is really hard work, just like restorative justice is really hard work. There are no shortcuts to this work, but the hard work is what makes it good work. We have seen as tribes and as indigenous people, one, we've used this again since time immemorial, and it has been effective for our communities. But we also see how it works today, and there's plenty of evidence to prove, despite this being hard work, it is effective and it is good work. And so I think, and maybe this may be biased, but I think it's very worthwhile to invest in our communities. And this reminds me of a webinar I attended from the Native Center for Behavioral Health, a webinar about peacemaking. I tend to go to a lot of those. The speaker said something that I really liked and that like stuck with me. And so I usually mention it when I talk about how, this is hard work, but it's effective. We know it works because we've done it for, centuries, for years. She said, sometimes the Western ways don't work for us. So we go back to reclaiming our ancestral knowledge, and this has worked for us. We come from great people, and we knew what worked, and we came from great healers. We came from people who, before colonization, did not have prisons or jails. We existed this way for a long time, and we need to return to these practices in order to heal. And so I just really like that quote. Can you go to the next slide? Great. So I talked a little bit about circles and circle keeping. And so let's do a brief overview. Again, not a lot of time in this webinar, so it will be very brief. But if you reach out to me or TLPI, there's actually an upcoming circle keeping training, and that usually happens once a year. And so we can refer you to that, and they give travel scholarships. It's a super cool program. I've done it myself. And we also just can connect you with other people who are trained specifically in circle facilitating. So again, brief overview. You might not get to know as much as you'd like to know, but just going over that briefly. So circle keeping is something that often happens in peacemaking. Many traditional tribes, tribal practices involve some form of talking circles as a dispute resolution, but also as a process of being in community with one another. A talking circle involves individuals sitting in a circle, taking turns expressing their thoughts on a particular issue. In the circle, everyone has an equal place. There is no hierarchy. That is very important. So if there is let's say, a tribal judge in the circle, they are not, at any hierarchical level than anyone else in the circle. Same thing for elders, although, of course, we do give respect to our elders, but there's no hierarchy in the way that we view, like in Western hierarchy form. Oftentimes a talking piece is used and passed around the circle, and the talking piece can be anything that's significant. It can be a feather, a basket, a rock. It can be an other treasured object. So it can be significant in terms of culture and tribal values and beliefs, but it can also be just significant, personally, either in like the community that's using it or doing the conflict at the time. I will say I bring peacemaking sometimes in circles to my family as the eldest daughter. And I have used a TV remote before, which is so not influential. But so again, like I say that to say that like peacemaking and circle keeping can also be flexible based on what we're using it for. But this is more, in traditional settings. But the main point is that only the person holding the talking piece is allowed to talk. And the process requires active and deep listening, which is not always easy for people to do. But yeah, it's definitely a practice, something I am still practicing. But again, it's hard work, but it's good work. Historically, Native cultures used talking circles as a way of bringing people together for the purpose of teaching, listening, and learning. And more recently, talking circles are being used to facilitate these healing processes. Talking circles can be focused on establishing community norms and building strengths and relationships, in addition to dispute resolution. We can go to the next slide. So I do not have time to get again into the full, what a circle looks like, but just briefly going over what a general circle format looks like. So a circle could be multiple rounds. I mean, it will be multiple rounds, but each round can be multiple times. So just know what I'm talking about the first round. That first round could be 3 different times around the circle. But yeah, this is the general format. So the first round is about creating the foundation for dialogue. So we have the welcome, we have everybody's introductions. There's usually an opening prayer or an open ceremony to ground people. And then we have check-ins about feelings, any like hesitancies. And during these few, rounds, we usually have a guidelines consensus. So importantly, there is usually a circle keeper, and that doesn't mean that the circle keeper actually doesn't get to decide anything. And it's again still non-hierarchical, but they do help to facilitate the process. And I do think that that's pretty important if you can find one. And through these first few initial circles, they usually come up with guidelines, and everybody has to agree to them. So some of the guidelines are like basic to circle keeping, like no talking over another, but there might be some other guidelines specific to the community or the issue. There's often a storytelling round that kind of gets the facts of what the issue is or what they're talking about right. There's an acknowledgement of everyone present, and then just a clarification of the purpose of the circle. So just grounding everybody back into that. So the second round, which again can be multiple rounds, is about expressing needs and interests. Again, communicating feelings. It's about identifying the needs, interests, and a shared vision. There's usually a summary about that. And the circle keeper is really essential for kind of they might prompt some like questions to kind of get, not everybody, I tend to be an overshare, but not everyone is like that, right? Like some people need some prompting to really like get to the root of the issue of what they want and what they need and what their interests are. And the circle keeper might, help facilitate some of those questions. And this round can go on as many times as needed. It's usually one of the longer rounds. And we can get to the next slide. So the third round or rounds is about exploring options. So after we've identified some of those issues and interests and issues, and we might talk about that a little bit more because as you're exploring options, you might realize, well, actually, like this is really important to me too. But this round is really focused on exploring like the options, so like the solutions, like how do we move forward in a way. And you know what? I feel like solutions has a specific like connotation as we like walk through the Western world, like has to look like exactly like this. And sometimes it's a little bit more gray, or sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced, and that's okay. And in this round also usually takes a long time. And then there's a possible consensus for action. So again, the circle keepers are kind of, helping get to these options. They're also prompting questions that might help the circle and community get to an option of how to move forward. And then the next round or so is about building consensus and a sense of unity. So points of agreement, everybody's like talking, they're like, yeah, that sounds good. You know what I mean? And then next steps, again, the keeper kind of help set this up for them. And like, so a keeper has to be really, really good at listening because they might hear some things and some tidbits. And then when the talking piece gets back to the keeper, they might say like, so this is what I heard. Is this right? And then it goes around again. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what. Or somebody could be like, no, that's not really what I want. And then we go again and again. Again, really hard work, but it's really good work. It's effective. So that's kind of what that round looks like. And then there's the closing round. So there's agreements. Some circles do like a written agreement, especially if it's more of a court process. And every tribe has their different ways of doing it. Every community has their different ways of doing it. But there is some sort of agreement of how to move forward. There's a checkout round. How is everyone feeling? And then there's a closing ceremony or prayer. So as you can tell, this is like a lot of work. And circle keeping can last 30 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on the issue, or if they're just, we're just checking in on feelings and whatnot. It could also last days. Obviously, it can have as many breaks as it needs, but it can be a long process. It can be a shorter process. And that's kind of the beauty of circle keeping is it can be whatever the community needs it to be. And I think that is gorgeous. And I think that is what makes it so effective. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So now I'll go a little bit into why peacemaking and restorative justice in general is important. Again, I am biased because I love it so much, but reasons why I think you should think it is important as well. We can get to the next slide. So I'm a talker, and so we probably don't have time to watch this 13-minute video, but it is such a good video, and I very much recommend it. And we can put it in the chat, or I'll send it afterwards in an email. But Native American Rights Funds has Indigenous Peacemaking Initiative, and I'll mention it later in this webinar too. That is really great. Brett Shelton is the lead on that. And they did this really great video that has, Justice Robert Yazzie and some other justices, other community members that have engaged in peacemaking and circle keeping. And it just talks about how it's been impactful in their community and what they've seen and why it's important to them. And I think it's really cool to hear from people who have on the ground experience about why they think it's important and the changes they've seen in their community. And so I think this is a really great video for that. And we will send it out to make sure that you have access to that later. But yeah, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we'll go a little bit into other reasons that peacemaking and restorative justice matters. So again, I'm super passionate about this and excited about it. The fact that tribes are leaders in restorative justice. It came from our people. We have the knowledge and traditions to report restorative justice, and we are currently leading the ways. Healing to wellness courts are deeply rooted in restorative justice, peacemaking courts and peacemaking programs. We have other super innovative areas of law and areas of resolving conflict and areas of preventing harm that I'm just super passionate about. I think that often there's this narrative that tribes have a lack of resources, and absolutely, I'm not like downgrading that. Like there is a lack of criminal legal resources and money and infrastructure. That definitely is an issue, but also like. I am just really passionate about the strengths that tribes do have, and I find that restorative justice, peacemaking, and traditional ways of resolving or preventing harm and conflict is where we really have strengths, and people follow us even if they don't know it. People follow from us and take from us, and so I just think that that's really cool, and I think it's important that we continue that trend. Historically, tribal restorative justice has been intentionally limited by the federal government as a means of eliminating tribal sovereignty. I did go to law school. I am a little bit of a legal scholar nerd. So I won't go super into depth and bore you all. And there are entire books and articles written on the subject that are incredible, and I can email some of those out as well. But just to note that, yes, historically, tribal sovereignty has been limited by directly attacking tribes' practices of restorative justice. Um, Notably, we see this when Congress passed the Major Crimes Act in 1885, which was enacted in response to a murder by one Native person, Crow Dog, of another Native person on a reservation. The other person was Spotted Tail. So in this issue with Crow Dog, the Lakota tribe imposed a restorative justice practice rather than a carceral one. It required that Crow Dog's family offer an apology, money, blankets, and horses, and the family of Spotted Tail. And this was concluded by the families coming together and talking this through, right? Kind of, I imagine, much like a circle process, or their version of it. And then by this action, the dispute was settled internally. Both families were okay with it. The tribe was okay with it. It was very much a sovereign, practice of what they get to do. However, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the government of the Dakota Territory was outraged by this result. They saw it as an injustice on their ideas of what Western justice is, and they arrested Crow Dog. And they charged him with murder, and then they found him guilty, and they sentenced Crow Dog to death. This issue went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Ex parte Crow Dog. Surprisingly, the U.S. Supreme Court, this is not what's happened, was on our side and reversed the conviction. They held that the United States had no criminal jurisdiction over Native tribes because tribes, as inherently sovereign entities, retain the right to administer their own law and tribal justice. But however, while the Supreme Court agreed that the matter was best left to the tribe to resolve, the federal government used the decision as an opportunity to state that, quote unquote, savage natives had let Crow Dog murder, quote unquote, without real punishments. That is punishment that they regarded as legitimate by the United States and Western systems. Within 2 years of Ex parte Crow Dog in 1885, Congress responded by intentionally breaking up traditional tribal justice systems and furthering the assimilation of natives into white settler society with the Major Crimes Act. This extended federal jurisdiction over a list of major crimes, including murder committed by a Native person on a reservation, whether the victim was Native or non-Native. This led to even more limitation of tribal sovereignty through enforcing U.S. criminal law and criminal legal systems and processes onto tribes. There is more on this particular subject in a book called Crow Dog's Case by Sidney L. Herring. Again, I can send these research out after the webinar. Love this book. I think it really goes into this specific topic wonderfully and better than I ever could. So moving on, restorative justice and peacemaking is a way for tribes to practice tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Again, I can't go in depth here as I like, but because we have seen historically how tribal sovereignty has been limited through this process, when we reclaim those processes, we're reclaiming our sovereignty. And I, again, am super passionate about this. Lauren Van Schilfgaard, who is my mentor and who I admire so much, and also used to work at TLPI. She is now a professor at UCLA Law. She wrote this incredible article called Restorative Justice as Regenerative Tribal Jurisdiction. I highly recommend. It's such a good article. I wish I read it myself, but it's fine. And again, I'll send out this resource later. But in this article, she says that restorative justice is an opportunity to indigenize tribal systems while also reclaiming jurisdictional powers in the pursuit of freedom from settler colonial constraints. Love that. To reclaim traditional law and justice systems and to address harm by tribes' own values and processes, to me, is textbook self-determination. And so that's another reason why restorative justice and peacemaking is important. Restorative justice and peacemaking gets to the root of the harm caused in communities, as we talked about, by restoring and the perpetrator of harm and healing them, as well as the person harmed and the entire community. And this is ultimately more sustainable and creates a more healthy community and safe community. And then again, because my focus lately has been on healing to wellness courts, we see that this particularly looks like healing people with substance use disorder at its roots, rather than it's the systemic aspect of that rather than just as individuals. You can go to the next slide. Examples for of restorative justice in tribes today. You can get that slide. Sorry, I lost my notes. Okay, so restorative justice is the foundation for healing wellness courts. Again, I'm talking about healing wellness courts first because that's where my niche has been lately. Healing wellness courts were implemented by tribes specifically to address the prevalence of maladaptive drug use in their communities. Tribes saw that Western adversarial criminal legal system was not getting to the root of the reason why maladaptive drug use was prevalent in their communities. And they saw that historical and generational trauma, childhood trauma, and other issues specific to Native people were often the cause of substance use disorder in their communities, which kind of differed from the way that other drug courts and treatment courts address things in non-Native communities. You can go to the next slide. So tribes saw that these roots issues were specific to Native people and thus needed solutions that were specific to target them. Solutions rooted in each tribe's culture, spirituality, and knowledge. Tribes turned then to therapeutic and restorative justice that were found in drug courts, but they implemented their own culture and values into this process that they found to be more effective for the specific issues in their community. So today, healing to wellness courts integrate traditional concepts of healing, community involvement towards healing, rather than punishing their addicted tribal members. And so that really is the root of what restorative justice is. This is restorative justice in action. You might be thinking, as I sometimes do, as somebody who overthinks, but it can also be a bit critical sometimes. How can healing to wellness courts be restorative justice if they use coercion to get involvement from participants in the program, and when they use sanctions when participants fail to meet their expected behavior, and sometimes those sanctions are incarceration and jailing? Additionally, how can they be restorative if some healing to wellness courts tend not to let those who are violent offenders in? And I think that these are very valid questions and worthy of being explored, critiqued, and asked in healing to wellness court programs and spaces. I would say that ultimately, I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't think it was worthwhile work. And I ultimately do think healing to wellness courts are restorative justice, perhaps limitedly so because of coercion and sanctions. But I guess I think that healing to wellness courts are restorative justice with adversarial moments within their processes. And that's just because we have to live in the world as it is. It is within, at least to a certain extent, the criminal legal system. And that's just what we have to work with. But I don't think that this means that healing to wellness courts are ineffective or not worth pursuing or using. Restorative justice, I believe, understands that we must work in the world as it is and under its current laws and barriers, and we must navigate that as tribes. I also think that healing to wellness courts are dynamic, so just like in other restorative justice processes, and they're going to evolve as tribes evolve, and as laws and cultures evolve. So we can work to limit the adversarial moments that we do see in healing to wellness courts, and instead increase the restorative justice moments or the restorative moments. And so we can do this within healing and wellness courts by lessening sanctions or thinking about how sanctions can prioritize accountability rather than punishment, even taking out certain language or the idea of punishment for sanctions and instead using the ideas of accountability. We could also start using sanctions as really a last resort effort, and instead focus on incentives and encourage healthy behavior, as well as therapeutic treatment that really gets to the root of these unhealthy behaviors. We can also make healing to wellness courts more restorative by lessening coercion as possible, or at least reminding participants that they do have choice and agency within their healing to wellness courts. Like they're choosing to be in the program, they're choosing the harder work rather than, the punishment and being incarcerated or whatever that punishment may be. They're choosing not to heal themselves. And that's an active choice that not only benefits them, but their families and community. And I think when we have those reminders, we increase moments for restoration to take place. And also, what I have been writing about a lot, I think bringing peacemaking and circle keeping specifically into healing to wellness courts can be expand the restorative justice function of healing to wellness courts. And there's ways to do that and just ways to be creative and innovative and increase restorative justice within healing to wellness courts. But as a whole, these are one ways that tribes practice restorative justice. We can go to the next slide. So here's some other examples of restorative justice that we see with tribes today. So again, as I talked about, there are peacemaking courts and programs that tribes have. Native American Rights Fund's Peacemaking Initiative has a list of some current peacemaking programs and courts that you can explore on their website. But just two notable examples for me is Navajo Nation has a really comprehensive peacemaking program. And their peacemaking program actually has like three different parts to it. And I'm not going to try to say the Navajo or Dene words for these things because I will butcher them. But if you go on their website, their peacemaking program website, they have these words and more context to them. But the three parts of their peacemaking program is they have Dene traditional peacemaking, and then they have Dene family group conferencing, and they have life value engagements. And the distinction between each of those is the peacemaking program is kind of more of what we talked about in terms of keeping a circle. Through they on their website they say through stories and teach making, the peacemaker dispenses knowledge in order to guide the whole toward a cathartic understanding of harmony that opens the door to transformative healing. The flow of harmony is a movement inwards towards the core issue and underlying truth. And it's about a recognition of that truth and a healing and a mutual mending. So kind of the stuff that we talked about. But then they also have Dene family group conferencing. So family group conferencing originated in New Zealand, but some tribes use it for their tribes and some other communities, non-native communities as well. It was originally used to allow social work practice to work with and not against Maori values and culture. And Dene family group conferencing through peacemaking program is an extension of peacemaking in response to the requirements of their laws calling on Navajo Nation to seek out culturally appropriate methods of prevention, intervention, and treatment from family disharmony, and to facilitate family harmony using measures consistent with Navajo Nation statutes and Dene beliefs. And this program assists in family preservation and reunification when called into courts. It's really about going into community family when there's conflict, specifically for like child welfare cases, and trying to resolve the conflict at its root rather than taking the child out of their family. And then their life value engagements part of the program. It's to further traditional services through the peacemaking program, and it depends on the individual and the group. The website lists that unlike peacemaking, engagements do not include both sides in the disputes. In such engagements, individuals or group meets with the peacemaker or traditional teacher in order to learn how to address the problem. The individuals or group learn to identify the problem as relating to their own personal accountability and willingness to grapple with these issues and serve themselves, their families, and their community by taking the first steps needed to reach harmony. And that could be dynamic dialogues, that could be storytelling, teachings, it could be cultural activities. It's really whatever the individual person needs in order to reach this place of harmony so that they can be better situated in their community. Another example of peacemaking I like to talk about is circle keeping in Alaska. Circle keeping is really prominent in Alaska in part because of, in the past, although there has been recent recognition of their criminal jurisdiction in VAWA 2022, we love to see it. But in the past, there was not explicit recognition of this. And so they were really working with hostile, state governments to create their own ways of protecting people and keeping people safe. And so circle keeping has been a really big part of them doing that. They've used it often in place of tribal courts. And it's used not just as a way of, keeping people safe and disputing conflict, but it's also as a way to share their culture with one another. And so there's really great examples all throughout Alaska. Other examples of restorative justice are implementing circle keeping and peacemaking into already established programs. So again, healing to wellness courts, implementing circle keeping into those processes, usually later down in the phases when, people who are struggling with addiction have done their own work, because this helps with them entering into the community when they're able to resolve conflicts of resolve the harm that they've caused in their community. We also see this a lot in family and child welfare courts and programs, again with family group conferencing and other circle keeping and peacemaking initiatives. Rather than taking the child out of the home, there's circles made to kind of see, even if the child does have to be out of the home for a little bit, where are they going to go? How can everyone agree with this? And also give agency to the family and to the child. We also are seeing alternatives to incarceration and fines that are, obviously healing and wellness courts. There's also wellness dockets if tribes are unable to support a healing and wellness courts. We're seeing like community service and cultural programming. We're also seeing this for alternative or restorative sentencing options as well. We also see sentencing circles, which is specifically a type of circle used to it's called sentencing circles. It can be sentences in terms of like years and jail, but it also or months or time spent in jail, but it also can be just like what accountability are we giving you? So that can look like community service or like speaking with elders or attending a beading class or fishing, whatever it is. So sentencing doesn't have to be so like criminal legal, jail. But that is another thing we're seeing as alternatives to more punitive justice. And then also, again, harm prevention is super important in terms of peacemaking and restorative justice. One good example I like to use is the Intertribal Court of Southern California. Southern California has a tribal youth court program, which is so cool. I love talking about it because it's just so cool and innovative. So it helps cultivate, wellness-based responses to offenses by tribal youth, utilizing peer decision makers. So first of all, there's youth on this court who get to help decide and guide youth who have used drugs and who are dealing with this. But it also has a great harm prevention program where, one, by bringing youth in to engage in this and engage in the community helps prevent these harms because they're seeing, what it does in the community. But they're also sending youth to college classes and taking federal Indian law classes and tribal law classes. And it's just so cool. And it's a way to get youth involved in their community. And also classes specifically talking about tribal restorative justice practices, which is, I love it. And anyways, it empowers them to engage in their practices and in service of the community and, keeps them away from using drugs. And I think that's really cool. And I just have the and more because tribes, again, they're doing really innovative things, things that I don't know about, things that are different than these categories. And they're evolving, again, as tribes needs evolve and as tribes evolve themselves. And I think that's really cool. Okay, I have talked to you all so long. Next slide, which I believe is the question slide. It is. Yay. Okay. I don't know if Abby and Kat, you guys picked any.
Yeah, well, we had a few questions in the chat. Thanks, Grace, so much for your wonderful presentation. We had a few questions in the chat from folks just trying to connect with one another. BJ had a question about whether there were any tribes that were allowing guardian ad litems into the peacemaking process or circles. I don't know if you know of any. I know some folks responded in the chat, but just wanted to highlight that one. just in case.
Yeah, I don't specifically know anything about that, but super cool that people are connecting with one another and talking about that. Sorry to be of no help, but glad that somebody is helping.
That's okay. And I know Pitt River does share guardian ad litem recordings in their peacemaking process. I don't know if they're included in the peacemaking circle, but in their code, they do allow any community member to have significant information on the child to be a part of the process. So not sure if that's like an overall broader definition to allow for guardian ad litems, but they might be someone to connect with as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that was all of the questions we had so far in the chat. I don't know if anyone else had any additional questions for Grace.
Oh, Kat, can you say the name of the tribe again?
Oh, Pitt River in California, the Pitt River tribe. I can share their tribal code that's actually on the NARF Peacemaking program website. So I can share a link as well to their tribal code that if folks would like to see that. And they're also a great resource as well. So I can share that website as well. You're welcome. And if there's no additional questions, I just want to thank you, Grace, so much for your wonderful presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending today's overview of Indigenous Restorative Justice Peacemaking webinar. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the Walking on Common Ground website, which is walkingoncommonground.org. It will also be sent out via our mailing list and as an email to all attendees as well, with the resources we've mentioned today. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars on peacemaking and restorative justice. The webinars will be on the third Wednesday of each month. Upcoming webinars will be April 17th and May 15th. The webinars will begin at the same time, 9 a.m. Alaska time, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And our April 17th webinar will focus on tribal peacemaking and peace circles, comparative models and implementations, and will be presented by A. Nikki Borchard-Campbell, the Executive Director at NIJA. So the registration link will be shared in the chat as well, and we will be sending that out as well to all attendees who would like to register. But as a reminder as well, we'll be sharing for the next slide a link for our evaluation for this webinar. So there's a QR code, and we'll share the link in the chat box. But please take a moment to complete the evaluation. Your feedback about today's webinar is greatly appreciated. As I mentioned, all recordings will be posted on Walking on Common Ground, and we'll share our contact information as well in a few minutes. But thank you all for joining.